And so moving along then in Derrida to the next section of Grammatology, section 2 is called Nature, Culture, Writing. And now what Derrida is going to do in this second half of the book is essentially to deconstruct the opposition between nature and culture. Nature and culture, it's going to turn out, is going to be a false opposition. And the thing that Derrida likes to do, of course, is to show how traditional logocentric metaphysical philosophers set up these oppositions, these absolute oppositions between speech and writing, nature and culture, the authentic versus the inauthentic, and all those associations, and to show that they're essentially false by scrambling the oppositions and showing that, for example, culture is part of nature, nature is part of culture, and therefore they don't constitute an opposition to quite the degree to which it can be said to reinforce an entire metaphysical system and give it an authority. So this is what he does. He sets up these, shows how philosophers set up these pairs of opposites, and then he goes through and deconstructs them by showing that the opposition between them is actually false. And nature, culture, writing. Writing, of course, is the thing that he's going to demonstrate that in the logocentric tradition is associated with falsity, inauthenticity, with culture, with artifice, and that it corrupts nature. And we'll especially see this in his analysis of Rousseau, in which Rousseau associates writing with civilization, and civilization, of course, corrupts the noble savage. And he's going to talk about, now in the chapter that we move on into here, which is the first chapter of part 2, which is called The Violence of the Letter, from Levi-Strauss to Rousseau, he's going to show that Levi-Strauss is basically a follower of Rousseau, an adherent of Rousseau, regards Rousseau more or less as the first anthropologist or the founder of what would later become anthropology, and basically that Levi-Strauss's attitude toward writing is consistent with Rousseau's. In the introduction to this section here, Introduction to the Age of Rousseau, Derrida talks about how the three great moments in the metaphysical tradition are Plato, Rousseau, and Hegel. Those are the three great moments, and they all associate writing with something secondary, a supplement, a poison, something that degrades and erodes the authenticity of the voice, and the metaphysics of presence, which the presence of the voice immediately exemplifies because it has direct access to the logos. Speech is a representation of thought, writing is a representation of speech, writing is twice removed from thought, and is therefore seen as exterior to the tradition. Now, one of the things, too, that Derrida likes to do is to attack, as I said, he functions as a kind of autoimmune disorder within Western civilization. He likes to play the role of the antigen that attacks the immune systems of these traditional metaphysics by finding where their membranes are and attacking those membranes. Later, in a later work called The Double Session, which is a long essay, one of his best actually, he'll develop this theory. He'll call this membrane, borrowing a term from female anatomy, the hymen. The hymen is that which he will say has a number of associations, playing with the trace. It has a number of associations that links it to the hym on the one hand, but also to different kinds of membranes. The nictitating membrane of the fish and the reptile over the eye, that's a type of hymen. The hymenoptera, the ants and the bees. So he plays with this association of the hymen as a membrane, something that's always a boundary. In the woman, it's the membrane, the in-between, that divides her state of being a virgin from being experienced. And so it's the in-betweenness. The hymen is basically an undecidable. It's the in-betweenness that his theory of the trace will exemplify, and that the hymen, he will say, hymen is also related to terms that have to do with spinning and weaving and the creation of textiles. So the hymen is also the construction of texts and textiles out of traces through the play of signification that he wants to show, to use to destabilize these older metaphysical traditions. But the hymen is also the membrane, and it's what he likes to attack and assault. So in the previous chapter we had seen him set up the opposition in Saussure between linguistics on the one hand and writing on the other. Linguistics and speech, identifying linguistics and speech, with writing as something exterior to that. In the case of Levi-Strauss, he's going to show here that the interior for Levi-Strauss really is Levi-Strauss's distinction. He quotes Levi-Strauss to the effect that Levi-Strauss says that if we get rid of all the other distinctions by which men have differentiated barbarians from the civilized, and we were to keep one of them, I think we could keep the one that says There are those who have writing and those who don't, and those who have writing are civilized, those who don't are basically not. They're non-civilized, basically. But they are also, he's going to, even though it sounds the opposite of what he's going to say, which is to say that oral traditions, the societies of the pre-literate peoples that he'd like to stay with as an anthropologist, are the ones that he regards as authentic, as manifestations of nature, as pure societies that are uncorrupted by written traditions. And he's going to demonstrate, Levi-Strauss will demonstrate in a personal anecdote, how writing corrupted this society called the Nhambiquara that he lived amongst. But before Derrida gets to quoting from Tris Tropique, Levi-Strauss's account, he quotes another account, which is called, it's from the same people, also from Tris Tropique, about the battle of proper names, where he says that there's something that is a well-known phenomenon amongst primitive societies, which is to say that you don't give away your proper name. The proper name is something that you keep, and it's not, there's a very strong prohibition against letting anyone know it, because if someone knows your real name, then by the principle of sympathetic magic that exists in these societies, they can exert magical effects against you if they're in possession of your name. But Levi-Strauss says that while he was staying with the Nhambiquara, there was a quarrel between two little girls, and one of them came up to him and whispered into his ear the name, the proper name, as a means of getting vengeance on her enemy, the other girl. And the other girl then came up to him and revealed the proper name of the first girl. And then pretty soon, all the children, he knew all the proper names of all the children in the tribe, and before long, he also knew all the proper names of all the adults. So Levi-Strauss calls this the battle of the proper names, in which we have, and this account occurs before there's any mention of writing amongst the Nhambiquara, as an account of a kind of violence that's associated with this battle of proper names. So even within, he wants to highlight, before he enters into the discussion of the chapter from Tris Tropique called The Writing Lesson, he wants to highlight in your mind this idea that violence is also associated with the oral society in a supposedly pure state. It's not pure. And he also wants to remind you that his version of writing, the way that he uses writing, as he defined it in Saussure as archy writing, as the common root between speech and writing, as the matrix of signification that generates all forms of differentiation, is something that he sees. He doesn't necessarily see oral societies as not having writing, even if they don't have writing in the colloquial sense, in the sense of inscribing upon specific surfaces. He believes that the moment that we are generating, or the moment that people, even if they're in an oral society, are generating signification, systems of classification and difference, such as kinship systems and genealogies, they're practicing a kind of archy writing, a kind of primordial means of signification, which is an early form of writing. So it's an archy writing. So, and he does see that he wants you to associate this act of violence, as it were, about the unveiling of the proper names, as linking it with violence in this oral instance, where there's no writing mentioned yet in connection with the Nhambiquara. So then he moves on in this chapter to Levi-Strauss's account in Tris Tropique about the writing lesson. And he says that what Levi-Strauss recounts is the time that he spent amongst the Nhambiquara and introduced writing to them. So he gave them all, Levi-Strauss says, he gave everyone pencils and sheets of paper, I suppose to see what they would do with them, and before long they would look to see what he was doing, actual authentic writing, and before long they were imitating writing, but they didn't understand writing, they weren't literate, and they didn't understand how to do it in the correct sense, but they imitated it. And then there came, they just simply drew wavy lines, basically. But then there came a point at which the chief of the tribe, then smarter apparently than anyone else, learned how to do this, draw these lines, and pretended that it was a form of writing that only he could read, then used it, these scribbles, illegible scribbles on a piece of paper, to hold a meeting of the tribe, in which he used it to reinforce his power and his authority by pretending to read from this sheet, so-and-so is going to get this bow and arrow as a reward for whatever the deed that was. And then next, so-and-so would get this thing, and then that thing, and then he would go down the list and he would delineate his power to those in the tribe who would then receive things. And so Levi-Strauss wants to point out then that there's a distinction between writing here in this case as an intellectual event and writing as a sociological event, as a power structure. And in this case, He says that it wasn't an intellectual event because the Nambaqua didn't know how to use writing, even though it was introduced to them by the anthropologist, Levi-Strauss himself. They didn't know how to use writing, but the chief immediately used it for political machinations. He used it to reinforce his power. So then later that night, when Levi-Strauss goes back to his tent and reflects on all this, Derrida recounts how he reflects and generalizes from this particular episode to a theory of history in which writing has always been used to exploit for creative or dominant minorities at the center of civilizations to use writing to exploit those who don't have writing, to submit them to the yoke of those who do. And so he generalizes this, and then this leads him to the idea that writing basically is a power structure that's used. It's negative. It's a power structure that is used by man for the purpose of exploiting and lording power over other societies. And so he sees it in this sense. But Derrida deconstructs this by then going on to point out that we've already seen an example in which, well, basically what Levi-Strauss is saying here is that the Nambaqua, he's identifying the Nambaqua with a state of nature, writing with culture. Writing comes in and it introduces division, strife, hierarchicization, the chief lording it over everyone else, and it introduces violence basically into the society. And Derrida says that the assumption here is that the Nambaqua did not have violence prior to the introduction into their society of writing. And he says this isn't the case. We've already seen the example of a type of violence with the battle of the proper names. But in addition to that, he goes through and he lists passages from Tristropique and some other of Levi-Strauss's descriptions of the same people who are already, of course, guilty of violent acts of all kinds. Sometimes some of the tribesmen would come up to Levi-Strauss and ask him to put poison in the food of one of their enemies in the tribe that they felt they had to eliminate. And so violence was already there, and so Derrida wants to point out that this undermines Levi-Strauss's whole metaphysics, which is consistent with the metaphysical tradition in which writing is supplemental to speech, as secondary and intrusive, and something that corrupts the noble savage, something that is seen, that enters into society and corrupts and leads to violence. This whole thing undermines that, the presence of actual violence that's there amongst the Nambaqua before writing comes in. Because Derrida, it isn't that Derrida wants to privilege writing over speech. He's not doing that. He simply wants to deconstruct the metaphysics of presence that associates speech with presence and writing with something that's exterior to it. And he wants to he wants to erode the membranes between pairs of metaphysical opposites by scrambling the opposites so that you can see that the one is in the other. He wants to maintain that by means, for example, of archy-writing, that there is a kind of writing amongst oral peoples, writing in a different sense from which it's ordinarily thought, but it's there. And that the opposition, therefore, that is held up in the metaphysical tradition between nature and culture is a false one. And it depends on begging a number of questions and making a number of assumptions about maintaining the rigidity of this artificial opposition. I do want to say, though, he does make these, I think his deconstruction of Levi-Strauss is good and it's interesting. I think there's a tendency of anthropologists to revere the people that they study, especially oral peoples, as exemplifying a more pure way of life than us moderns who have fallen into a state of degradation. But I think that one of the problems with Derrida's deconstruction here is that he ends up making the case, because basically if we think of the Phaedrus, the text in which King Tamus resists the introduction of writing when Tote brings it to him and he says, here I want to introduce to you the pharmacon of writing that will act as a cure, that will help people, and Tamus says to him, no, it will just efface and erode memory. People will stop relying on their memories and they'll rely on this exterior source. Basically, Levi-Strauss himself is in the role of Tote, introducing writing into the society as something negative that destabilizes it and is seen as a negative principle. But the idea is that certain societies, and they tend to be societies that are ancestor worship dominant, have a conservative resistance to new forms of technology. And I don't think it's the case, and Derrida is making it seem as though this idea that writing, if it isn't what introduced strife into these societies that are already corrupt to begin with, since human nature, Derrida seems to be saying, is fundamentally corrupt, then we can't maintain that new technologies that are introduced into societies are dangerous, and in fact they are. This is one point that I want to underline here, that writing is something, it is a technology that does damage to societies. Just as Neil Postman said, every new technology that is introduced into a society comes along and destabilizes a particular way of life, destabilizes that society in some fundamental way. So I think we need to be wary of Derrida's idea here, in which he downplays the disintegrative role of writing.